we're about to begin the next session. Well, what you've all been waiting for, it's my privilege and my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Ambassador Marina Kaljurand, who has served as a leading Estonian and global civil servant, and especially has taken a leading role in improving cybersecurity. Ambassador Kaljurand grew up and studied in Estonia, including the University of Tartu, and the Estonian School of Diplomacy, and we were fortunate to have her as a student here at the Fletcher School as well. She's served in the Estonian Foreign Ministry for most of her career, rising to ambassador to Israel, Kazakhstan, Canada, the US, and Mexico, and later serving as foreign minister. With the growing concerns in Estonia and elsewhere about cybersecurity, Ambassador Kaljurand turned her considerable talents and energies to this area, serving as Estonia's representative to the UN Group of Governmental Experts, the GGE, and now chairing the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace. We're proud to have her offer some perspectives on this issue of cybersecurity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, Professor Trachman, dear Joel, thank you so much for a kind introduction. It's a real honor and privilege to be here at the Fletcher again. And Joel didn't mention that it's almost 25 years since I first entered the campus of the Fletcher. I'm proud to be one of the class of '95. I'm happy to still have my contacts with the Fletcher, and the contacts have survived, and I've even become closer, and I'm honored to be a member of the Fletcher European Advisory Group. And coming from a poor Eastern European country, as Estonia was then, I often remember the two gentlemen with F name, Austin Barclay Fletcher and Senator James William Fulbright, who changed my life. I never met him. Senator Fulbright died the same year when we studied here, 1995. But as an Estonian ambassador to Washington, D.C., to the United States, one of my first things was to visit his widow, Harriet, and to express my deepest gratitude for their academic year. I was here as a Fulbright student. But now to cyber. Yes, I come from Estonia, a country which is known for Skype. Skype was invented by Estonians using Scandinavian money, and NATO Cooperative Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, as well as for being the first country in the world to introduce e-government, e-taxation, e-voting, and thousands of other e-things. So when Hamlet was asking to be or not to be, we asked the same question at the beginning of the 90s, to E or not to E. And the answer was to E. We call it today E-lifestyle. In 2007, Estonia was the first sovereign state in the world to be subject to politically motivated cyber attacks, supported by another state. I served then as Estonian ambassador to Russia. You didn't mention Russia, by the way. I was in Moscow, and I tried to find ways of cooperation with Russian authorities. I failed. As you know, it takes two to tango, and there wasn't interest to dance with me on that side. We received help and assistance from our friends and allies in Europe, but also on this side of Atlantic. We learned several lessons from the attacks of 2007, and I would say that also international community learned many useful lessons. We learned that our e-lifestyle also entails e-challenges and e-responsibilities. We knew then, and know even better now, that no services are completely secure, whether online or offline. But we can and must face these challenges by taking appropriate steps to minimize the risks. The questions that we faced then, I would argue, are today as important as they were 11 years ago. Attribution, responsibility of a state for the acts of a non-state actor, countermeasures, even triggering Articles 4 and 5 of NATO, cooperation, exchange of information, assistance, ESOS, applicability of international law, and so on. We learned that states can be efficient in providing cybersecurity if they cooperate with each other and other stakeholders, both nationally and internationally. Over the past decade, cyber incidents have grown in severity and number. DDoS attacks have become increasingly commonplace, while new threats have emerged. 2017 was ripped with cyber-related headlines, many of which spoke to different facets of an increasingly complex challenge. WannaCry, NotPetya, malware worms were at the forefront of a new wave of ransomware attacks. The growth of the Internet of Things helped fuel a nearly two-fold rise in the number of DDoS attacks in 2017 compared to 2016, while a frightening number of botnets lie dormant, waiting for an unknown purpose. Meanwhile, incidents of hacking democracy continued. According to Estonian Information Board, which is our CERT, and according to the report of 2018 that analyzed the incidents of 2017, Estonian National CERT processed 11,000 recorded cases, 2,000 more than a year before, in Estonian computer and data communication networks. 1/4 were cybersecurity incidents that directly impacted confidentiality, integrity, availability of data systems. There were no critical incidents that would have posed threat to people's life or health. And there were 122 high-priority incidents that affected functioning of a website or service considered important for the users, which was 200 incidents less than in 2016. As a new trend, there were 32 cyber incidents in the health sector that affected hospitals and general practitioners. But even as the nature of the cyber threat has grown and evolved, the need to enhance international cooperation and adopt a multi-stakeholder approach has not changed. In fact, they have to be accepted as the foundation of an effective global approach to ensuring cybersecurity. So, in my remarks, I would like to discuss both aspects: international cooperation and multi-stakeholder approach. While the cyber domain has become accepted as an integral element of any approach to international security and national security, it is not one that states can effectively manage alone. Given that the cyber realm does not have borders, international cooperation is of utmost importance. Unfortunately, attempts to foster such cooperation at an intergovernmental level seem to have reached an impasse or a standby, at least for the time being. The failure of the GG, United Nations Group of Governmental Experts on Developments in the Field of Information and Telecommunications in the context of international security, that is GGE, and stalemates in other diplomatic fora show that the ideological divide on the use of ICTs is too deep, and governments do not have enough political will to reach agreement in the near future, at least not in all aspects of cybersecurity. I will bring some examples. States repeat the same mantra: commitment to an open, secure, stable, accessible, and peaceful ICT environment, but act sometimes very differently. I mean the states that see the use of ICTs as a tool of interfering into their domestic affairs and brainwashing their citizens with Western values, who promote balkanization of internet or introduce additional restrictions to the users and content of internet. States repeat that cyberspace is not a lawless jungle and international law applies to cyber, particularly the UN Charter in its entirety. Although I admit that some states do it with different level of enthusiasm. But at the same time, states are not ready to take next steps in interpreting how exactly international law applies to cyber. Academia has done their work. There was reference to Tallinn Manual 2.0. Now it's the job of the legal advisors, of government authorities to look into interpretation and start interpreting international law. While regrettable, this does not mean that discussions will or should come to an end. Talks have to continue under the auspices of the United Nations, as well as other frameworks. And hopefully, states will find the courage and determination to return to constructive negotiations, ideally sooner rather than later. Thank you. Having said that, lots of space. I would like to acknowledge the initiative by the United Nations Secretary General launching the high-level panel on digital cooperation that will advance proposals to strengthen cooperation in the digital space among governments, private sector, civil society, international organizations, technical and academic community, and all other relevant stakeholders. It is chaired by Jack Ma from Alibaba and Melinda Gates, and I'm proud to be a member of the panel. It will have its first face-to-face meeting in 10 days in New York, and it is asked to introduce a report. I will stop here about the panel. Tomorrow we will have a chance to discuss the role of international organizations and United Nations in more details, and I'm really happy that Assistant Secretary General Fabrizio is also here to join us tomorrow on the panel. But I would like to say still some words about the United Nations and the failed GG, so-called failed GG. Again, I had the chance to participate in the work of the GG. I have said it earlier, and I would like to make it very clear that I don't agree with those who say that the GG of 2016-2017 failed completely. Let me clarify. It disappointed international community, and it failed to adopt a consensus report. It even failed to recognize chairman's impressions. This was an alternative document proposed by the chairman aiming at describing the process of the GG. But even that wasn't acceptable to all delegations. As you know, international discussions on the misuse of ICTs and the potential implications for international security have been taking place within the United Nations since 1998, when the Russian Federation tabled a resolution within the UNGA First Committee on Disarmament and International Security. There have been 5 GGs, and not all of them were able to produce reports. There was one field where states and governments were not ready to make any progress. That was international law. But I have to admit that in 4 fields, existing and emerging threats, capacity building, confidence building, politically, legally non-binding norms of responsible behavior, in those fields we had good discussions, there was progress made. As a lawyer, I understand the importance of international law, and I understand the difference between legal norms and political norms. but I see also room for political norms in cybersecurity. I'll come to that later. So what were the lessons learned from the last GG? There were some things that I should be taken into account when preparing for the launch of the next GG, which most probably will start in 2019. First, GG can't remain an exclusive club of a small selected number of states. 25, 20, 30, no difference. I understand that it is impossible to negotiate with 190 states in the same room. It was very difficult even with 25, but the process has to be inclusive so that all states who want to be part of the discussion, who want to contribute to the discussion, should have the chance to do it, either directly or through regional organizations. All these things have to be discussed. Second, GG reports have to be promoted much more actively and widely. If we want GG reports, which are being adopted by UNGA, to be widely known and followed, we have to talk about it much more than we're doing so far. The outreach has to be wider, and the outreach has to be better focused. And finally, the process has to include non-state actors: industry, academia, civil society, for the same reasons that I mentioned before. As to the mandate, it is clear that with the same mandate, the next GG will fail the same way. Because today there is no readiness and no political will among states to make any progress in international law, as I said. The most difficult questions being IHL, Article 51 of the UN Charter, inherent right of states for self-defense, countermeasures, due diligence. It means that if states want to avoid the failure of 2017, they have to think how to continue with, how and where to continue with the discussions on international law. Discussions on international law and repeating applicability of international law to cyber is crucial. It's crucial. We have to do it. But we have to be very careful how to include it into the agenda of the next GG. So, what to do in the situation when states have taken time off, and most probably nothing will happen during the coming year? I would argue that the international community does not have time to wait, and I will also argue that there is a unique opportunity for other stakeholders, non-state actors, to lead, or at least to contribute to the process and discussion. I understand the central role of states. I understand that non-state actors will never replace states, but they can complement to the process. Therefore, I'm a very strong supporter of multi-stakeholder approach or multi-stakeholder model. Despite states' traditional dominance over all questions related to international peace and security, their role within the overall ecosystem of cyberspace is central but limited. Governments alone simply cannot dictate all aspects of a domain in which civil society writes much of the key code. The private sector owns nearly all the digital and physical assets. Academia is much more effective in analyzing the complex issues of applicability of international law to cyberspace, and IT community just has the best technical experts. Given this complex landscape, it is clear that a multi-stakeholder approach to cybersecurity is the only effective way forward. One in which all stakeholders have a unique role, including in developing norms of responsible state behavior. For example, non-state actors can play an important role in developing norms of behavior that might at some point develop into norms of international law, customary international law or treaty law. I've seen how international organizations work. There is so much political decision-making there. Sometimes when a proposal, a good proposal, is made by a state, a certain state, it already attracts votes against. So maybe it's the time for non-state actors community to make proposals, and maybe it is easier for states to accept those non-political proposals. I would like to bring some examples, and of course I will start with the Global Commission of the Stability of Cyberspace. You can find it online, cyberstability.org, that I am honored and privileged to chair. And I would like to recognize the commissioners in the audience. I think that Jonathan is somewhere here, at least he was, Jonathan Zittrain. Okay, he left, he's not listening. He's never listening to me. But I see Professor Nye, who is one of our distinguished commissioners. And I'd also like to recognize Duncan and Martha. Your work on norms was very useful to our commission in our deliberations. So we are working closely with academia, with different stakeholders. The Commission was launched in 2017 at the Munich Security Conference to enhance international peace, security and stability by proposing norms and recommendations to guide responsible state and non-state behavior in cyberspace. It engages full range of stakeholders and is global. It has representatives from Beijing to Berkeley, from Tallinn to Johannesburg. The central question is stability in cyberspace, how to preserve and improve it. As you all know, there are several definitions of cyber stability. We define stability in cyberspace as the condition where individuals and states can be confident of their ability to use cyberspace safely and securely, and where the general availability and integrity of the internet and internet-based services is assured. The Commission has approached its deliberations in a bottom-up manner and is guided by significant shared core beliefs, including democratic and multi-stakeholder approach to governance, need to promote development and growth, need to balance rights and obligations for both states and non-state actors, centrality of internet being open, and so on. It did not start from a clean slate. We followed and benefited from the work of United Nations, G20, G7, regional organizations, OSCE, as well as norms developed by Microsoft, Internet Society, Carnegie Endowment. We also followed the work of Internet Governance Ecosystem, Net Mundial Initiative, other initiatives within the wider Internet Governance Forum ecosystem. The first task of the Commission was to examine how existing norms can be applied to cyberspace, where new norms are needed, and how to put the norms in use. We strongly believe that norms work best when the international community is seized by it, when it shapes both the behavior of states and non-state actors and decisions of national leaders, and when it makes clear to all that some actions fall outside the boundaries of what is accepted. The first norm we proposed in November 27 was the call to protect the public core of the internet. The norm says, without prejudice to their rights and obligations, states and non-state actors should not conduct or knowingly allow activity that intentionally and substantially damages the general availability or integrity of the public core of the internet, and therefore the stability of cyberspace. We also defined the elements of the public core of internet to include internet routing, the domain name system, certificates and trust, and communications cables. As you see, the definition of the public core of the internet is based on functionality, while at the same time leaving room for others to be able to pinpoint assets and services that they think should be included or excluded as part of that functionality. We had consultations with external stakeholders, after which Commission clarified the definition of the public core of the Internet to include packet routing and forwarding, naming and numbering systems, the cryptographic mechanisms of security and identity, and physical transmission media. Why did we start with this norm? Because we recognize the global reliance on cyberspace, the increasing dependence of other infrastructures on its reliability, and the potentially dramatic consequences of its disruption. And today I'm proud to say that this norm has been received pretty well in international fora, in IGF, ISOC, even European Parliament mentioned it. The next norm our Commission was dealing with was the norm to protect electoral infrastructures. We introduced it in May this year, and it reads, states and non-state actors should not pursue, support, or allow cyber operations intended to disrupt the technical infrastructure essential to elections, referenda, and plebiscites. Why this norm? Well, I can be brief. Because it's topical, it's timely, and it touches almost everybody nowadays. And also, it is one of the most sacred norms, the norm of non-interference. I'm referring to Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, which says that all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. Nothing reflects genuine political independence more than national participatory processes, such as elections conducted freely and fairly. Those protective measures have now come to be challenged again in the digital area. Here I would like to say as a remark that my country, Estonia, is the only country in the world that is conducting online voting for local elections, national elections, and elections of European Parliament. We started in 2005, and during the first elections, about 2% of votes were cast online. Last year, when we had elections in 2017, 32% of votes were cast online. So if somebody says that online voting is not secure or people don't want it, that's not true. Our people know what's happening in the world. And our people were asked, do you want to continue with online voting in the situation where hacking democracy is spreading all over the world? And we have DNC hacks and other hacks. The answer was yes. We want to continue, and it is the responsibility of a government to secure elections, secure exchange of information, integrity of data, and authentication and identification, those online. But back to the Commission. Our Commission is working on another group of norms which we hope to adopt next week during the Commission meeting in Singapore. I'm not going into details with those norms, just want to say that I hope by that time we finish with the norms and we can start looking into more philosophical questions like the future structure of cybersecurity, ways and models of cooperation in cybersphere, principles, and all these questions will be reflected in the report that the Commission will publish by the end of 2019. We also follow very closely what other multi-stakeholders are doing, because we think that many good ideas are coming from the wider community than only states. And we think that supporting each other, we can be a pretty powerful lobby group. For example, we think that the proposal of Carnegie Endowment, a norm to protect financial stability against cyber threats, is excellent. A norm against manipulating the integrity of financial data, and I'd really like to recognize Tim Maurer and his team for doing this extraordinary job, which has been recognized also, for example, by G20 finance ministers in 2017, and we also have big hopes towards the G20 presidency or chairmanship of Japan next year, knowing Japan's interest and commitment and engagement with cybersecurity. Once more, going back to the attacks of 2007, they were targeting primarily banks and disrupting significantly online banking. And trust me, that in Estonia, a small disruption of e-services is a big thing. We don't carry cash and we don't write checks. That is why we have been very vocal and very strong in promoting the protection of financial systems from cyber incidents. I proposed the norm to the GG of 2013, and it was well received in the corridors. But as soon as we came to the negotiation tables, it wasn't very much supported. So that's why I think the norm proposed by Carnegie might have a better chance, and the norm proposed by Carnegie is dealing not with financial systems, but with the integrity of financial data. Some words about another important player in the field representing industry, Microsoft. I'm not going to talk about the Geneva Convention and the Organization of Attribution. Everybody knows that I'm very critical about both of them, but I would like to recognize Microsoft for listening to others and for adjusting their ideas and proposals. And I know how much work Angela has done in that field. You have, although you have a small boy back at home. So thank you for doing it, and Microsoft is doing a great job. But I would like to, I'm not mentioning Duncan yet in the context of Microsoft, you can do it later. But I would like to mention the Tech Accord, which was also mentioned by previous speakers, which was launched by Microsoft this spring and was signed by Microsoft plus 33, perhaps now the number is bigger, technology companies, including Facebook, Nokia, and so on and so on and so on. It makes commitments in 4 areas: stronger defense, no offense, capacity building, collective action. More or less at the same time, there was another initiative by Siemens. Siemens introduced at the Munich Security Conference Charter of Trust for Secure Digital World, which was signed by Siemens plus 6, including Airbus, IBM, Daimler. The Charter introduced 10 principles for a secure digital world. Both documents are good. I would have preferred to see one, but I can imagine that it's not easy to agree among industry and then put the same question in front of governments and states. And when you have more than 190 of them, and then you can understand how difficult it is to find consensus and reach understanding among different governments. There are also other examples, but I will stop here. I would urge states and other actors to review and seriously consider these proposals and support them. I'm not naive. I understand that engaging other stakeholders is difficult. When I say engaging stakeholders, I'm not talking about political slogans, I'm talking about real partnerships. And there are several reasons. States do not have enough practice of engaging non-state actors. There is not enough trust, and there is not even common understanding. What does inclusive process, multi-stakeholder model mean? If all states can more or less agree on including industry and private sector into the discussions, there are very different views on academia, civil society, IT community. Again, we all talk about inclusiveness, but our actions are different. And here again, I'm looking at the United Nations and regional organizations, to like-minded states to lead the way. Because it's time for states and non-state actors who share democratic values and who believe in an open and secure cyber future to come together and to act together, globally, boldly, to protect a free, safe, stable, accessible, and available internet, while fostering the continued growth and development of the use of ICTs. To conclude, I would like to bring another example from my own country, the last one, Promise, illustrating how powerful a civil society can be if connected and using digital opportunities. It's a movement, Teeme ära, let's do it. It started 10 years ago, when a couple of young people noticed garbage in Estonia, in the forests, in the streets, on the beaches. And believe me, Estonia is a relatively clean country if compared to some other countries. But they decided to clean the country. They decided to collect the garbage in one day. They developed a mobile mapping platform, which they called Let's Do It, and deployed an army of volunteers to try to identify as many dumping grounds as it could. So people were walking around and taking photos. This was followed by a logistical operation. They had to organize volunteers and trucks to the places where garbage was found. On the 3rd of May 2008, it was the first cleanup day in Estonia. 50,000 persons cleaned up 10,000 tons of garbage in 5 hours. I have to remind that the country is 1.3 million, so 50,000 is a big number for us. Almost the whole country was cleaned up. 4 years later, 96 countries participated in the first International Cleanup Day. 2014, there were 12 million people who participated. And then they decided to go global. They decided to launch a new initiative, World Cleanup Day, with 150 states, I don't know how many millions of people, aiming to collect 50 million tons of garbage. Yes, the World Cleanup Day will be tomorrow, on September 15th. It will start in New Zealand, and it will finish 36 hours later in Hawaii. There will be 24-hour non-stop broadcast, and it is said to be the biggest global civil society environmental initiative. And you can check my words. I contacted the local volunteers. Their leader is Kim Starbucks, who, by the way, is also Jumbo. She is leading the beach cleanup tomorrow at 10:30 at the UMass Boston campus. So, Joel, I'm not asking people to sabotage the conference. I just wanted to show how powerful civil society can be in a digital area. And you can find the app, and you can clean up your places whenever you find and whenever you want to do it. So let's do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for an illuminating, inspirational, and wise presentation. Will you take a couple of questions?
Sure, with pleasure, if we have time.
If people want to ask questions, please come to the podium.
There are people who want to ask questions.
Hi, Ambassador. Thanks for your speech. My name is Jiaxun Li, and I'm a student at Tufts. I come from China. My question is this. I had a debate 3 years ago as a high school student. The proposition was internet is ultimately a democratizing force, and I lost that debate. So my question is, how do you engage with actors who might not share democratic values in the first place? For example, Jack Ma from Alibaba, who's maybe disinterested or cannot support those values, and ring states that we talked about.
Thank you for the question. It's a very good question, because I think that the future of the security of cyberspace and the future of internet depends on the states who so far haven't decided whether to be like-minded, who believe in the benefits that the use of ICTs can provide, or be with the other group. Because when we talk about cybersecurity, well, maybe 50, 60 states have an idea what we're talking about. 150 don't. And they will be those who will come online. They will be those who will decide the future. The best, I would advise to look at the World Bank report, which was published 2016, which is called Digital Dividends. And that report makes a very clear picture. So it's not a propaganda. It's United Nations, it's World Bank. And it makes very clear how those societies develop who take advantage of the ICTs. They can develop their governance, economy, culture, all fields of society. So I think that's the best reference. And advise them to look at Estonia, which has transformed from a poor Soviet republic in less than 20 years into a democratic country governed by the rule of law, member of the EU, member of the NATO, member of the OECD, and so on and so on and so on. So I strongly believe in that. And the next time, send me an email. I'll send you a couple of links when you have to fight for internet freedom.
Thank you very much.
I'll ask a follow-up question to that, because it was interesting that you said there are 40 or 50 states which are in effect the cyber haves, or the internet haves, or the ICT haves, and 150 so who are the have-nots. And I guess the question is, in your work with the Commission and other places, is there a sense that those 150 states that will be going online someday, are they supportive of the development of cyber norms? Are they hostile to it? Or are they simply apathetic and uninterested in the discussion?
Thank you for the question. First of all, I have to clarify, maybe I exaggerated a little. Okay, let's say we have 80 countries, not 50, but 80. What's their attitude? I can say from the experience in the GGE, where we had 25 representatives and very good geographical representation. Majority of them were looking towards China and Russia. Why? I would say that we, as like-minded, we are not doing enough. Or maybe we're doing it in a wrong way. Wherever we go, we start preaching about human rights, about gender equality, and so on, which is necessary, but which has to be done in a way that the others listen much more to us than they do today. I've been talking to a president of a not democratic country, I'm not going to name the country, it wasn't Russia, about democracy, not using the word democracy. So which means that we have to be smarter in explaining our understandings, our values, and showing the future. So far, I'm pretty critical towards us. Well, I say towards us, I mean like-minded countries. So we have to do much more with capacity building, we have to do much more with development cooperation, and I can say, and again, speaking on behalf of my country, we have looked into that together with development cooperation on digital services, we pay more attention to cybersecurity and just educate, raise awareness. It's important to raise awareness of politicians because it has to be high on political agenda. If it's not, there's not enough resources, there's not enough human resource, financial resource to deal and tackle with that. So I think that so far we haven't been very good, but I see lots of room for improvement. And sorry for being so open.
Madam Ambassador, Michael Farrell from Georgia Tech, it's a pleasure to be here with you. I've heard you speak many times. Living in the backyard, living with Russia in your backyard, having had experience in dealing with them both in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and or in the neighborhood, maybe not backyard, up close and personal, what advice would you give to this group, having had firsthand experience, dare I say, kind of scars on your back and dirt under your fingernails of having dealt with them in this space? What advice would you give, and I'm sure they're lovely fingernails, what advice would you give to this group in having the context in dealing with them, not only from what we're dealing with here in the United States, but with other Western countries and abroad? Because, again, it's unique presents a unique set of challenges, and I think you have experience that might be germane to this group.
Thank you for the question, and I like very much that Russia is in our backyard, because usually everybody says that we are in the backyard of Russia. But what's my advice? My advice is to look critically at what's happening. Not at the words, but at the deeds. I would argue that Russia has become more unpredictable, more aggressive than even 10 years ago. These are facts. What happened in 2007 in Estonia was a piece of cake. But later came Georgia, later came Ukraine, later came violation of international law. So the history of my country is complicated. Well, we were not only occupied by Russia, but we were occupied by everybody who had time to stop by. So maybe we are too emotional when talking about our past. But what we learned, you have to be realistic, you have to do everything yourself to preserve your independence, and you have to be surrounded by friends who share the same understanding. You should not be naive. You should see what's happening on the other side of the border. I'm not saying we should not have contacts. I'm not saying we should not have business relations or exchanges of students. We have to have that, but in a balanced manner. And advice on this side of Atlantic, we have to stick together. We have to speak in one voice, and we have to have common position. Because trust me, Russia is very, very creative and very smart in playing one country against another. And sometimes we are naive to fall into the trap. And just now I want to say that it's so good to be former foreign minister. You can say whatever you want, and you're not responsible for that.
If you'll indulge me with a follow-up and redirect, as some might have characterized their activities in geopolitics and traditional military affairs as opportunistic, right? So the
aggressive, unpredictable, opportunistic, yes, we can use these words.
Would you believe that they are consistent in their activities in cyberspace? Do you think they are more so or less so, or that they could be characterized differently of what they do in cyberspace versus other domains?
But again, we have the facts. My country was among those countries that supported UK and US in attribution of NotPetya. So the attribution wasn't easy. It had to do very much with political will. But yes, my country was among those 9 countries that supported the attribution. I think that says everything. And we have also Raza from Lithuania here. So I'm not the only Baltic.
One of the questions a few moments ago, a young woman from China referred to the idea of the internet being a democratizing force. You mentioned capacity building, and you also mentioned the importance of increased outreach for what your commission is doing. Barack Obama, when he was running for the presidency, proposed a global education fund aimed at young persons who might otherwise be studying in madrasas, for example. In the Middle East, the internet is powerfully important. Gordon Brown, former Prime Minister of Britain, is involved with global education. Julia Gillard, a former Prime Minister of Australia, is as well. My question to you is there a connection between the work that you're doing and these efforts led by persons who had important political positions who are now in the private sector, trying to engender wider understanding, which almost inevitably involves an increased use of the internet?
If I talk on behalf of, Alan, thank you for the question. If I speak on behalf of the Commission, then we are not directly dealing with awareness raising or education or capacity building. But the composition of the Commission is such that every person has outreach. Every person has a network. So among us are professors like Professor Joseph Nye. There are people with different backgrounds, people who are being listened to in their communities, in their countries, in their regions. So that way, we think that maybe at least we hope that we are contributing to capacity building and raising awareness. But yes, we are not a development cooperation organization.
Hi, Herb Lynn, Stanford University. Listening to your description, I heard a lot of things that you said about maintaining cyber stability and stability of the internet and so on. But I didn't hear anything related to the broader topic of, or perhaps a different topic of information warfare and propaganda, public diplomacy, influence operations, and so on. And I was wondering if you would care to comment on why you didn't, or why that's not included. I mean, I can see good reasons for not. I was wondering if you'd just comment on that.
Herb, thank you for the question. Yes, because when I discussed what our commission is doing, we're not doing information warfare. We're not dealing with propaganda. Because as I said, our commission is global. We'll try to deal with the questions that are not political. That's why when we talked about the protection of electoral systems, we were talking about the critical infra of electoral systems, not propaganda, not information wars, which doesn't mean that the topic is not important. It is, and is being discussed in many other forums. But for our commission, yes, we're not dealing with that. Duncan, that's not fair.
Duncan Hollis from Temple University. I wanted to ask you, probably not in your capacity as commission chair, but you made these comments about international law, and so you listed the sticking points in international law, countermeasures, IHL, Article 51. You didn't mention sovereignty, so my first question is, would you add sovereignty to that list? Because at least I've seen this whole battle between sovereignty as a rule versus sovereignty as a principle that Joel started us off with earlier today. And then I guess my second question is, among those outstanding international legal problems or debates, unresolved, which one do you think deserves attention first? And I'll leave to you why you would give it attention first, but which one is the one that we should be focused on most closely?
Yes, I absolutely agree with you. I should have mentioned sovereignty, but I said among them, so I wasn't mentioning everything. But yes, sovereignty was a topic that we were tackling when discussing applicability of international law in the GG, and we were talking even about cyber sovereignty, which for me doesn't make sense, because the cyber sovereignty was explained by same nations. It's a sovereignty, but our laws prevail. Well, when I was educated, then I was told that if you give some of your sovereignty away under international law while concluding treaties, then you give it away. You can't claim it back under your national laws. So it doesn't make sense. But maybe I didn't mention it because for me it was more not a legal question, more a political question. What should be the next one? My personal preference will be Article 51, inherent right of self-defense. Because, why? Because when we were discussing applicability of international law to cyber, the only sentence we could agree was international law, UN Charter in its entirety particularly applies to cyber. And then we could not repeat Article 51 as in a separate sentence or even in the same sentence. 51 was a number we were not allowed to say loud. And it doesn't make sense for me. So maybe I would start from the parts of the UN Charter because it's so clear, it's so understandable, and it's so logical. But again, it's not a legal question, it's a political question, unfortunately.
Please join me in thanking the ambassador for this wonderful presentation.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you.
We now have